Hello and thank you so much for tuning in. Today I'm going to be doing my first official entry in my Palette Probation Series. If you want to know more about the series, I did do an intro video on it and I'll have it linked down below. But basically I'll be going through a predetermined set of palettes in my collection, trying to figure out if they still make sense in my collection, and if they don't, I'll be decluttering them. So for the first palette in this series, I'm going to be talking about the original Too Faced Chocolate Bar. And this palette actually launched back in December of 2013. And I consider it to be one of the big three palettes. That is one of the big palettes from back in the day that really got people hooked on eyeshadow palettes. It was in the sort of neutral series, so a lot of people found it to be very, very wearable. And ironically, this chocolate bar palette actually came last out of the other two palettes in the big three, which would obviously be the Urban Decay Naked and the Lorac Pro 1. So the Urban Decay Naked palette launched in late July, early August 2010. The Lorac Pro came in mid-2012, and the Too Faced Chocolate Bar didn't launch until December 2013. So it launched almost 3.5 years after the original Naked palette and a year and a half after the Lorac Pro 1. However, a lot of people still seem to really like the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. In fact, I remember seeing lots of videos where people said that they preferred the Chocolate Bar palette to the other of the big three. And one of the gimmicks that I think helped this palette sell and do very well initially, even though there were two already well-established neutral options on the market, is the fact that it does smell like chocolate. I will say I've had my palette probably for about three and a half years now, and it definitely still smells like chocolate. Now, as you can see, I have the slimmer version of the packaging. This palette actually went through two different palette redesigns. The first one, not even that long after it came out, about a few months after it launched, the company decided to put the palette in the slimmer packaging that you see now. The original packaging was much bulkier, as you probably remember, and I remember a lot of people being really upset about it because, I mean, the palette came out and literally not even 6 months later they were already redesigning it to make more convenient packaging. And then the palette went through a second redesign in December 2014, which was alongside the release of the successor to the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette, the Semi-Sweet Chocolate Bar. And they decided to go ahead and put names on it. And I do actually have the version that does have the names on the palette, which is pretty nice. I definitely am one of those people that likes to have names on a palette because those plastic inserts, they tend to get lost, so it is nice to have the names on there. Before I go into the looks that I created with this palette, I did want to actually talk a little bit about how it ended up here, and a lot of that has to do with a larger point that I wanted to make, which has to do with how the beauty community talks about how they really like items, or they consider items to be their favorites. I heard a lot of words tossed around in regards to this palette, that it was a Holy Grail palette, that it was a desert island palette, that it was just their favorite palette of all time. And I do feel like I didn't have that experience. I feel like for me, about half the shades in here are really great and the other half are just very mediocre or complete duds. And then I realized, in seeing people do looks with this eyeshadow palette and talk about the palette throughout the years, people were really only reaching for the same half of the palette that I also enjoyed. So I thought to myself, these people are saying that they really like this eyeshadow palette and that it's the best thing on planet Earth, but they're only ever using the same 8 shades in the palette of 16 colors. And it got me to thinking, or it sort of revealed a bigger point to me, which was that, you know, I think people in the beauty community tend to use adjectives and words a little loosely without really backing them up, because I personally feel like if you only like 8 shades out of a 16 shade palette, and that 16 shade palette also happens to cost $49, then you probably don't really like the palette, or it's not a favorite. I mean, I would hope that your favorite product of anything is something that you could enjoy most of, and that's not what I saw when I saw people using this palette. And it's fine to say that you still really like this palette even though only half of the shades are good, but I think that people should say that, you know, that should definitely be a big asterisk when people are doing these so-called reviews. And it's unfortunate to see the beauty community going more towards that, with lots of people doing first impression videos. And I don't have a problem with first impression videos because I understand that they are first impressions, but a lot of people treat first impression videos as reviews and try to recommend products based on, again, a first impression. And I think that that's really problematic. But anyways, I say all that to say that I feel like reviews in the beauty community have always had a little bit of an issue. I mean, nowadays we don't even really have reviews, it's all just first impression videos. But, you know, I think that there's something to be said about people calling a palette their favorite palette of all time, and they only use half of it, and it costs $50. You know, nothing wrong, again, with liking a palette and only liking it for some of its shades, but that definitely needs to be something that you clarify, especially if you're going to be recommending it and it costs $50. And that actually brings me to my next point, which is price. Like I said, the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette is $49, and it's actually one of the only big three palettes that stayed the same price from its launch. The Urban Decay Naked and Lorac Pro palettes have of course gone up in price over the years, whereas the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palettes have always remained $49, which I think it's really nice that they were able to keep them at that same price. And so now I wanted to get into the looks that I did with this palette. I did 5 different looks, and the first thing that I did before I started using this palette again was I just went ahead and swatched the shades out really quickly to get an idea of what I was working with again, you know, and see what tones were in the palette, because I didn't want to pair this with other palettes or eyeshadows in my collection as I saw fit. I wasn't going to be using this palette all by itself, and that helped me kind of get an idea of what I was working with. So for the first look, I actually decided to pair this palette with the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette. I just thought that some of the warmer tones in the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette might pair nicely with the Anastasia Beverly Hills. And one of the shades that I think a lot of people's eye go to when they see the Chocolate Bar palette is Cherry Cordial, and it's looks like it would be a nice burgundy in the pan, but it turns out being a lot darker than that. And so I thought maybe some of the tones in the Modern Renaissance palette would help. So for the first look that you'll be seeing, I used the shade Milk Chocolate in the crease, and I came to realize that this shade actually on my skin tone is a little bit too chalky to use as a transition shade. And I actually remember that from using this palette in the past, but I tried it out again. It's still ashy, go figure. So you'll see that I kind of changed my technique as I went along. The next shade I used is Hazelnut, and I used this on the lid, and I wanted to kind of give this shade a chance because it is one of the shades in here that I just really don't like. Another thing that irks me about this palette, and just it'll irk me when any palette does this, is when there are duplicate shades in the palette. I feel like a palette is an opportunity to have versatility of eyeshadows, and when you have shades that are duplicated, you are losing out on opportunities. And yeah, there's like 3 metallic brown shades in this palette. We have Hazelnut, Haute Chocolate, and Amaretto over here. I'll give Amaretto a little bit of a pass because it's a little bit more red tone, but yeah, these 2 browns in here, they're literally the same shade. The only difference is Hazelnut has slightly more of like a glittery finish to it, whereas Haute Chocolate is more of like a somewhere between a metallic satin type of finish. Here from the Modern Renaissance palette, I went ahead and used Red Ochre and Venetian Red, and I kind of just mixed them together to get a crease shade for this look. And then I went back in with Cherry Cordial from this palette to add a little bit of depth, and it did add some depth, but I will say again, this shade definitely is one of the more disappointing shades in the palette because you would hope that it would be more red tone. And I know back in the day too, this was really, people were really excited about this because we really didn't have any red tone eyeshadows in palettes, especially sort of like in this matte finish. So it's a little bit disappointing, and it's definitely not a very unique shade anymore. So for the second look that I did with this palette, I actually ended up really enjoying, and I would definitely recreate this look. And I've actually done looks like this before. Basically, it's kind of like an old gold type of look, which I really love. So for this look, I went in this time with Milk Chocolate mixed with Semi-Sweet in the crease, which is what I would typically do with this palette. I really like Semi-Sweet. It's a really nice brown, and when you mix these 2 together, you get a really nice sort of more neutral shade that works really well in the crease for my deeper complexion. Then I went in with this shade, again, Cherry Cordial, here on the outer portion of my lid, and then also onto the lower lash line. I then went in with Gilded Ganache on my inner and outer lid, and I used Creme Brulee on the center to give kind of like a halo eye effect. And like I said, this look I ended up really liking. It might have been my favorite look where I used primarily this palette. For the third look, I tried to do something a little interesting because I think Too Faced still does this, but they include these little glamour guides with their palettes. And I decided, why not try out a look that's featured in the Glamour Guide. So I wanted to recreate this semi-sweet look that you're seeing here, and I actually did everything step by step to get the look. And what you'll see is I feel like I ended up with a very dated looking smoky eye. So I'm not sure if that's a result of this being an older palette, or these shades just looked really dated on me in particular. So the semi-sweet look first called for taking this shade Salted Caramel here and basically sweeping it from the crease to the brow bone area, and that's exactly what I did. I was actually expecting this shade to show up a lot lighter on, but I think it just ended up blending in with my skin tone. The next thing I did for the look was I went in with Strawberry Bonbon, which I probably never would have reached for in this palette, and I applied that to my inner and middle portion of the lid. Then I took the shade Candied Violet and applied it to the outer portion of the lid. And then I went in with Semi-Sweet into the crease and on the lower lash line. And again, I feel like I just ended up with a very dated looking smoky eye. It's not a terrible look, but it's not a great look either, I'll say that. And I will say too, Candied Violet, this shade here, a lot of people I remember said that this shade was a dud for them, and while it is definitely not a good shade, I don't think it's a dud. I do get pigmentation from this shade, as you can probably see in the look. You can definitely see the purple pigmentation there. This shade to me is very much alike a lot of other shades in this palette, which again, to me overall is very mediocre. So I'm not really sure why people necessarily singled out Candied Violet, because to me Candied Violet actually performs like a lot of the other metallic or shades that have glitter in this palette. So for the fourth look, I decided to use the Glamour Guide for a little bit of inspiration again, but definitely not follow it step by step. I took inspiration from this look here, which is entitled Haute Cocoa, and basically, as you can see, it's like a halo eye using sort of like burgundy tones on the inner and outer portion and a gold in the middle. And I don't even know why I didn't think to do that type of a look with this palette myself, because I have done that type of a look before, I think with the Subculture palette, and it's a look I really like, and just in general I think burgundy and golds work really well together. So because I knew that the shade Cherry Cordial in the Too Faced palette just wasn't red enough, I decided to go ahead and supplement with some redder shades in my collection. So for this look, I brought in one of my Look See Beauty shadows in the shade Heartbreaker, which is this right here. And then I also went to my Huda Beauty Warm Brown Obsessions palette, and I used this second shade here as a just transition shade. And I did kind of swatch them on the back of my hand here so you have an idea of what they look like. That's Heartbreaker there, and that's the second shade from the Huda Beauty Warm Brown Obsessions palette. I realized that once I brought out my Huda Beauty Warm Browns palette, I could have used this palette exclusively, because that Heartbreaker shade there at the top looks a lot like this first shade here in the Warm Brown palette. So basically for this look, I started with Heartbreaker by Look See in the crease, and I used the second shade from the Warm Brown Obsessions palette in my transition area. I then went in with Cherry Cordial on the inner and outer portion of the lid, and I finished off with Creme Brulee in the center. And as you can see with this look, you can kind of really tell what I mean when I say that Cherry Cordial is a very dark, almost blackened burgundy shade. It just looked way darker than I would have hoped for. I just feel like there are a lot of other shades where you can really get that depth that you're looking for, but still have it look very much like a burgundy, and you don't get that from Cherry Cordial at all. So for the last look, I didn't actually use the palette as a focal point. I really used it more so for the transition, crease color type shades, and I used primarily my Look See Beauty eyeshadows here. So I think they're all, yeah, all the ones I used are this half right here. So I basically use these cool tone blues that you're seeing right here. So from the Chocolate Bar palette, like I said, I went in with my trusty transition combo of Milk Chocolate and Semi-Sweet. And then as for the blue shades that I used, I went in with these three Look See shades here. This shade is Noir, this is Midnight, and this is Shiver. And I have Midnight here on the lid, I have Shiver on the sort of outer portion of the lid, and then I have Noir sort of padded in the center and then also in the inner corner. And to use one of the other more problematic shades in the Chocolate Bar again, I decided to go with Black Forest Truffle, which has a really nice sort of maroon tone to it again. along the same lines as Cherry Cordial, one of the more sort of unique colors at the time. But the problem is that it's chock full of glitter. I really feel like this shade as a matte shade would have just been beautiful in this palette, and they should have just left it at that, but they decided to add glitter. But I will say that I watched a video from Amber F, who is a YouTuber who does pan that palette videos, and she actually panned this exact palette last year. And I know I was complaining a little bit earlier about how people in the YouTube beauty community, a lot of them don't give very thorough reviews of anything ever. But if you really want a thorough, detailed, thought out like review of a palette, then definitely watch somebody who's panning it, because they will have more experience with the palette than anybody. And so she did a video where she talked about some of her tips with panning this palette, or it might have been in her finale video where she talked about panning this palette, and she mentioned that she was able to get through shades like Black Forest Truffle, which are atrocious because, again, mattes with glitter. I don't understand why companies do that. It's literally the worst formula for an eyeshadow. But she mentioned that she was able to get it to work for her by just tapping off the excess of glitter, which makes so much sense. I don't know why I didn't think of that myself. But I will say it is a tedious process. So because there's so much glitter packed into Black Forest Truffle, what happens is the actual matte shadow itself is not very tightly bound together either. So I found myself losing a lot of pigment even as I was tapping off the glitter. So it was kind of like a back and forth process of swirling my brush, tapping off the glitter, losing pigment, going back in to gain more pigment, but then having to tap off the glitter. So I had to do that about 4 or 5 times before I got enough pigment on the brush without the glitter. So it did work, albeit a little bit tedious. And I do really like the finished look, and I do like the berry purpley tone that Black Forest Truffle added without taking over the look. So overall I really liked this look, and I ended up liking how Black Forest Truffle was incorporated into this look. But again, I do feel like I could have gotten a similar vibe from a lot of other eyeshadows in my collection without having to go through nearly as much trouble. So now I've come to the part of the video where I try to see if I have any colors in my collection that are similar to ones in the palette that I actually like and think make this palette a little bit better than it actually is. So my favorite shades in here definitely have to be, first off, Creme Brulee, which was my favorite shade in here even from the beginning of me having this palette. It's just a really stunning gold. It has a little bit of a rosy shift to it. Then Gilded Ganache, which took me by surprise because it is one of those more glitter infused shades, but I do think because the glitters in here are finer and this is more of like a satin finish shade as opposed to a complete matte, it's a lot easier to work with, and it ends up being this really stunning mix between like an olive green, a gold, and a brown. And then of course the classic mix of Milk Chocolate and Semi-Sweet for me, which ended up being a really good sort of crease transition shade that leaned more on the neutral side. I also wanted to talk about Cherry Cordial as well, just because even though I personally didn't like the shade, I do feel like a lot of people want something in this tonal range, and I think that there are some options that achieve what Cherry Cordial should be doing but doesn't do. So for Creme Brulee, I came across sort of like 3 kind of sort of dupes in my collection. I feel like golds are one of those colors that you would think would be really easy to find a dupe for because there's so many of them across so many different palettes. But because companies can do so much with a gold, like there's just so much you can do with a gold. You can make it light, dark, put tons of different tones in it. It really makes it hard to find an exact dupe, and even in playing around with it, I think that's what made me realize that Creme Brulee actually is more of like a duo tone type of gold. It's not just a straight gold, it has a little bit of that rosy shift that I was talking about. But basically I have Creme Brulee here in the middle, and the 2 like closest shades I could find in my collection are this one here at the bottom called Smitten, which as you can see is a lot darker. This is a Luxie Beauty shadow, by the way. It has that same tonal shift to it, it's just a little bit darker than Creme Brulee. And then this shade up here is called Amber. This is by Anastasia Beverly Hills. I actually found this shade from Temptalia because I was just racking my brain trying to figure out what shades could possibly be a match, and Temptalia was a good source. Some of the shades I felt like didn't quite, again, get the tonal shift of Creme Brulee, and I don't even know why I didn't think to swatch Amber, but Amber is pretty close too, although the shift in Amber is not as strong, and Amber overall as a shade is not as vibrant or doesn't have as metallic of a finish as Creme Brulee. Next up, like I said, I really ended up loving Gilded Ganache, and honestly, I couldn't find anything in my collection that came quite close to Gilded Ganache. You would think, oh, it looks like an olivey green, just pick out any olive green color you have in your collection. But honestly, this shade really, looking at it, I would almost describe it more as like a satin brown with the golden like sparkles in it, which I think is what gives it kind of a more olivey tone. So anytime I swatched it next to any olive green, gold type shades in my collection, this ended up looking a lot more brown. But I'm not too upset over it, because I think what I really enjoyed about Gilded Ganache was the fact that I was able to achieve that kind of old gold type of look, which is a look that I've done many times before. So I'm not really at a loss for not being able to find an exact dupe for Gilded Ganache, because I can achieve the types of looks that Gilded Ganache gave me with other eyeshadows. Then of course there's the task of finding a dupe for the trusted combo of Milk Chocolate and Semi-Sweet. And for these shades, I couldn't find anything that I think was exact, but they're close enough in my opinion that I don't really care. I mean, these are going to be, again, crease colors, transition colors. So we have the mixture of the two right here in the center. And then for my dupe shades, up top here, which you probably barely can see, is Light Taupe. This is by Coastal Scents. I kind of found this last minute. I think this is actually a decent shade. It's a little bit lighter, so I probably would mix this with another shade and it would probably give me the same outcome as this. Then this shade here is actually Corduroy by MAC, and this tonally I think is very close to the mixture of Milk Chocolate and Semi-Sweet. It's just that this is darker. In fact, Corduroy and Semi-Sweet swatched next to each other look very similar, with Corduroy being cooler. So obviously adding Milk Chocolate to Semi-Sweet makes it a little bit cooler, more neutral. So these tonally are very similar. Then I have these two right here, which aren't great at matches, but again, neutral transition shades that are, you know, not overly warm. This shade right here is Mocha from the Too Faced Chocolate Bonbons palette, and I love this shade. It's not that far off, it's just a little bit more pink than the combo of Milk Chocolate and Semi-Sweet. And then here at the bottom we have Conundrum by ColourPop, which ended up being a lot warmer than I thought. It's more of an orangey type of brown. But yeah, these are the shades. Then of course, like I said, I would talk about some shades that sort of mimic the feel of a shade like Cherry Cordial, and these are kind of what I came up with in my collection. This right here is Cherry Cordial, and I mean, I don't know, I feel like you can look at it and tell that it looks very much just like a red tone brown. That's exactly how I would describe it. It's not a burgundy, it's not a crimson, it's just a red tone brown that just so happens to look very burgundy in the pan. So this shade up top that I have swatched above it is Deep Damson by MAC. This third shade here is Wild Raisin by Coastal Scents. And then this fourth shade here is the fourth color in the Huda Beauty Warm Browns Obsession palette, which it is just a warm brown. And I feel like, again, you can really see, like, especially with this one and this one, I would say, just how lackluster in terms of having a red tone they appear, you know, next to Deep Damson, which is a darker shade, but it has more of a red tone, and even Wild Raisin here, which is a little bit lighter, but has more of that red tone. So personally, I'm not a fan of a shade like Cherry Cordial, because I feel like there are other shades that can give me more red while still being sort of like a deeper tone shade. So I also wanted to mention some shades that I think are what you would actually want when you look at a shade like Cherry Cordial. I hope that that makes sense. But basically, I pulled out some other shades in my collection. I swatched Cherry Cordial here at the top for a comparison, and then these are 3 shades that were hanging out elsewhere in my collection. And as you can see, like, I picked shades that weren't, you know, it's not like I went for like a really vibrant burgundy or vibrant red. I went with shades that are still tonally pretty dark shades, but definitely have that red tone to them. So they're really good colors if you are doing a more red tone eyeshadow look and you want to add some depth. So again, that's Cherry Cordial at the top, which, as you can see, compared to these shades, looks so brown and so dull. But this first shade here that I have is Heartbreaker by Luxie, which I actually did use in a look that I did featuring Cherry Cordial. And then the second shade here that I have is Cute Alert by ColourPop. This is probably one of my most used shades by them. I reach for this color quite a bit when I'm doing red tone looks. And then this shade here at the bottom is Moments by Colored Rain, another great option. So these 3 to me, I think, add visually a lot more interest to any red tone eyeshadow look than a shade like this ever would. So now is the time when I actually give you my final verdict on whether or not I'm going to be keeping the palette, and you could probably tell from my tone throughout this entire video, but I'm actually going to be decluttering the good old Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. Sure, there were certainly looks that I did with this palette that I enjoyed, but there was nothing about using this palette for the past, week or couple of weeks where I felt like I had an epiphany as to why it really made sense in my collection. All the looks that I created with this palette that I liked were looks that I could achieve elsewhere in my collection using palettes and single eyeshadows that I just enjoy overall as a whole more than, looking at this palette and again, seeing half shades that I do really enjoy and half shades that I just don't care for at all. So I think the best thing to do would be to go ahead and get rid of this palette. I have already started on my second palette for this series. I'm actually wearing it on my eyes right now, if anybody wants to take a guess as what that could be. But thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments or suggestions for ways to improve this series going forward, definitely please let me know. I will be looking to kind of tweak it and make this better as I go along, and I hope to see you in my next video.